In this book, there are a cast of characters. There, of course, is Hitler. At this point in the book, Hitler is depicted to be a coward, but he is depicted to have an incredible vision of the future, which seems undiminished at any time. There is Goring is not in the picture yet. Himmler is in charge of the SS, and then Rom is in charge of the SA. The SA is a rowdy bunch of homos, rowdy bunch. And then so there's the SA. Hitler made the SS and put Himmler in charge. And then there is Goebbels. Goebbels appears to be a gentleman. Goebbels was too infirm to be a soldier, so he became the propagandist. And then there is another character, which must be named, and that his name is William Schreier. You know, I don't know much about William Schreier besides the words I read. I do see here it says with an introduction by Ron Rosenbaum. Rosenbaum, what an interesting name to write about Hitler with, right? And so there's this what do I say, tension or clarification, or there's a ruse, right? You know, I believe William Schreier is on Team Hitler. I think he is, at least in the sense that he has an open mind. I think that he says unflattering things to build up credibility. The reason I am reading this is because all around me there are restrictions now. I've probably gotten slightly worse throughout the years, but they're just things I can't say anymore. They're just shit I can't say anymore. I can't say it anywhere, right? This is a first world problem, but it kind of demonstrates the crux of it, at least how I see it, right? There's a bunch of people online now with really just silly, nasty names. They have very sexually degenerate names now online, and it used to be like that, but now it's like a lot. But see, mean things aren't said anymore, right? There's this guy called Romanian TV, and he brought up a good point. It's like these spaces for guys to go to be guys are gone. They've been, dare I say, colonized by the women. They have this new veneer, this new fucking polish over it. So they start using these degenerate names. Now I know it's quite a leap to make, right? But I believe that this is much like the Weimar Republic. There's just this age. I believe that 1924 in this book is not too different than 2024. There is a rising, sweeping wave of anti Semitism. And I went to the pro Palestinian protests. Okay, that doesn't really make sense when I say it like that. But when I went, it was a rally. It was cool. It was cool. Um, there were guys in charge in the crowd, middle aged men with vests, and they would say, "You cross now, you don't cross now." Because they didn't want anyone to get hurt. They didn't want anyone playing in traffic. They were fucking big ass SUVs plowing on through and shit. They didn't want anyone to get hurt. I was there at the Palestinian rallies, and it felt great. There was a sense of wonder and unity, and the opposition didn't even dare show themselves because we were too powerful and too many. And I met some fun people there. I met some really fun people there, but I'm not a part of that anymore. For as much as I just think it's gone too far. I think things have gone too far. I'm not going to play in traffic. And I asked myself, right, how far am I willing to go for these people? Am I willing to go all the way? No, I'm not willing to go all the way. Never, ever, ever fight unless you're willing to go all the way. I'll save you a lot of heartache and a lot of other people some heartache too if you just fucking if you just don't fight at all. Sometimes not fighting is better. If you're not gonna fight to win, don't fight is what I'm saying. And I'm not gonna fight to win that. It was fun. I had my rollerblades. They gave me some flags. Um, what I'm getting at though, this is a time of unrest, and there are factions forming. And while I will say that I am inspired by this book, I truly am. I find all the neo-Nazis detestable. I don't talk to them anymore. I listen to them because they listen to me. But I don't want to listen to them anymore. They're not real. In these groups, I've actually met people and I've visited, but I just still don't feel like they're real people. They're not in front of me. They keep me stuck to this fucking screen of mine. So I've let them all go. There was one neo-Nazi, and he had a half-black girlfriend. And I said, how white do you have to be to get into the ethno-state? And he said, half-white. And I said, that's not white, that's half-white. And I told him I'd be waiting for him at the border with my MP40 for his fucking mutant family. I didn't really mean it. I don't think the ethno-state can work for one fucking reason. There's no right of ascension. You can't. Even if you got the perfect people, and it went just like you wanted it to, what happens when their kids are in charge? Their kids are gonna fuck everything up because the kids didn't work for it. The whole point of the ethno-state is you have to work for it to get in. Unless they have to like go build a new one or something, it's not sustainable. And they asked me a question. They asked me a question. The one with the half black girl, he asked me a question. He said, the population of this place or that place in Canada is 98% white. How do we make it 100% white? And I said, I'm not prepared to answer that. I said, I'm not. I said that's not even within. That's not even something I'm willing to like. It's even describing it makes me more nonsensical. And so he said this. He said you breed them out. He says you just breed them and breed them and breed them until their genes go away like that. But he doesn't understand the concept of dominant and recessive genes. The thing about... I don't think Hitler was a Nazi. Marx was not a Marxist. Some of the Nazis think that there's like some huge socialist aspect to it, but Hitler clearly states, I don't care how we do the money thing. It will happen one way or another. That's what he says. If you gave Hitler a chance to come back, but all he had to do was be a commie, he would say, oh, okay, we will just change the uniform. What else would change? Not much. That's truly what I believe. I think people get caught up in the uniform. But now, a year and a half later, Goebbels' idol had fallen. He had become a petty bourgeoisie who deserved being booted out of the party. With only Ley and Feder dissenting, the Hanover meeting adopted Strasser's new policy and approved the decision to join the Marxists in the plebiscite campaign, to deprive the former kings and princes of their possessions. Hitler bided his time, and then, on February 14th, 1926, struck back. He called a meeting at Bamberg in southern Germany, shrewdly picking a weekday when it was difficult for the northern leaders to get away from their jobs. In fact, only Gregor Strasser and Goebbels were able to attend. Goebbels is a Marxist sympathizer. While Hitler doesn't really care about the economic policy, Goebbels thinks that there is much to be done with the Marxists and that they can be included. On February 15th, the day before Bamberg meeting, he confided to his diary, Hitler talks for 2 hours. I feel as though someone had beaten me. What sort of Hitler is this? A reactionary? Extremely awkward and unsteady, completely wrong on the Russian question. Italy and England are our natural allies. Horrible. We must annihilate Russia. The question of private property of the nobility must not even be touched upon. Terrible! I cannot utter a word. I feel as though I've been hit over the head. Certainly, one of the great disappointments of my life. I no longer have complete faith in Hitler. That is the terrible thing. My props have been taken from under me. To show where his loyalty stood, Goebbels went to the station with Strasser and tried to console him. 1 week later, on February 23rd, he records, "Long conference with Strasser. Result, we must not begrudge the Munich crowd their Pyrrhic victory. We must begin our fight for socialism." But Hitler had picked up the flamboyant young Rhinelander better than Strasser. On March 29th, Goebbels said, "This morning, a letter arrived from Hitler. I shall make a speech on April 8th at Munich." He arrived there on April 7th. "Hitler's car is waiting," he recorded. "What a royal reception. I will speak at the Bürgerbräu." The next day he did, from the same platform as the leader. He wrote it all down in his diary entry of April 8th. Hitler phones. His kindness, in spite of Bamberg, makes us feel ashamed. At 2 o'clock, we drive to Bürgerbräu. Hitler is already there. My heart is beating so wildly it is about to burst. I enter the hall. Roaring welcome, and then I speak for 2.5 hours. People roar and shout. And at the end, Hitler embraces me. I feel happy. Hitler is always at my side. And there's this sort of like glamour. There's this sort of glamour that he has over his followers. I'm not sure if it's charm, though. It's charisma, but it's not necessarily charm. I think it's because the Nazis are all misfits. I'm not saying in some fucking way, like, in the way the Goonies are all misfits and they all came together. What I mean is they're all misfits and they all see that Hitler's a misfit. And so I think it gives them confidence that they can make it too. Because the good old boys were in charge of everything. And that's something that I feel is similar nowadays too, is like this world, right? This shameful fucking world that we live in. There is no better time for me to be alive. There's no better time for me to be alive, okay? This window of opportunity that this world presents is rapidly closing. This is the best time. It's a time of uproar, and the reason why it's good, despite all these misgivings, is the good old boys are all gone. Hello, Martina. All their institutions, all of the old world is either falling apart or completely gone. Okay, look, the cars are not being sold in the car lots. All right, no more new video games are being made. They're remaking the video game from last year and the year before that. This is much like the Weimar Republic. So it's a time of opportunity. And I think that's why so many misfits came to Hitler's side, is because they finally had a chance to shine. They would have been kept at bay. You know, I remember the 90s, okay? The thing about the 90s is it was really, really boring. It was really, really boring. Here's how boring the 90s was. Can you say hello, Martina Official? Please, me as a fan. The 90s were really boring, and here's how boring the 90s were. The 90s were so boring. You want to hear about the presidential scandal that happened? You want to hear about the presidential scandal that happened in the 90s? I'll tell you about the huge scandal that happened in the 90s. The president of the world, the most powerful man in the world, got a BJ. His secretary gave him a BJ. That was it. That was the whole thing. Okay, that's how boring the 90s was. And the reason it was boring is because everything was decided. There was no new change. There was nothing that moved. And so just like history is repeating itself is what I'm trying to say. Everything that has happened 100 years ago is starting to happen now. And I don't want to use this book as a fucking instruction manual because they lost. They fucking lost. Look, here's the thing is they lost, all right? And it's okay to lose, but you just have to be ready for the next war. I want to win, okay? I want to win. And when I say I want to win, what I mean to say is there's a lot of people that can win. We can win. But right now there's a lot of people losing. And so there's instructions in here somewhere to get the ball rolling again. But I can't simp for Hitler anymore. Goebbels is simping too much for Hitler. I don't understand how Goebbels was Minister of Propaganda. Hermann Müller, the last Social Democrat Chancellor of Germany, and the head of the last government based on a coalition of the democratic parties, which had sustained the Weimar Republic, had resigned in March 1930 because of a dispute among the parties over the unemployment insurance fraud. He had been replaced by Heinrich Brüning, the parliamentary leader of the Catholic Center Party, who had won the Iron Cross as a captain of a machine gun company during the war, and whose sober, conservative views in the Reichstag had attracted the favorable attention of the army, and in particular of a general by the name of Kurt von Schleicher, who was then quite unknown to the German public. Schleicher, a vain, able, ambitious desk officer already acknowledged in military circles as a talented and unscrupulous intriguer, had suggested Brüning's name to President von Hindenburg. The new chancellor, though he may not have realized it fully, was the army's candidate. A man of sterling personal character, unselfish, unmodest, honest, dedicated, somewhat assured in nature. Brüning hoped to restore stable parliamentary government in Germany and rescue the country from the growing slump and political chaos. It was a tragedy of this well-meaning and democratically minded patriot that in doing so, he unwittingly dug the grave for German democracy and thus unintentionally paved the way for the coming of Adolf Hitler. Brüning was unable to induce a majority of the Reichstag to approve certain measures in his financial program. He thereupon asks Hindenburg to invoke Article 48 of the Constitution and under its emergency powers approve his financial bill by presidential decree. The chamber responded by voting a demand for the withdrawal of the decree. Parliamentary government was breaking down in a moment when the economic crisis made strong government imperative. In an effort to find a way out of the impasse, Brüning questioned the president in July 1930 to dissolve the Reichstag. New elections were called for on September 14th. How Brüning expected to get a stable parliamentary majority in a new election is a question that was never answered. But Hitler realized that his own opportunity had come sooner than he expected. The hard-pressed people were demanding a way out of their sorry predicament. The millions of unemployed wanted jobs. The shopkeepers wanted help. 4 million youths who had come of voting age since the last election wanted some prospect of a future that would at least give them a living. To all the millions of discontented, Hitler in a whirlwind campaign offered what seemed to them in their misery some measure of hope. He would make Germany strong again, refuse to pay reparations, repudiate the Versailles Treaty, stamp out corruption, bring the money barons to heel, and see to it that every German had a job and bread. To hopeless, hungry men seeking not only relief, but new faith and new gods, the appeal was not without effect. Though his hopes were high, Hitler was surprised on the night of September 14, 1930, when the election results came in. 2 years before, his party had polled 800,000 votes and elected 12 members to the Reichstag. This time, he had counted on quadrupling the Nazi vote and securing perhaps 50 seats in the parliament. But on this day, the vote of the NSDAP rose to 6 million, entitling the party to 107 seats in the Reichstag and propelling it from the ninth smallest party in the parliament to the second largest. At the other extreme, the communists had also gained from 3 million votes in 1928 to 5 million with their representation in the Reichstag. The moderate middle-class parties, with the Social Democrats, despite the addition of 4 million new voters at the polls, the vote of the right-wing nationalists of Schulenburg dropped from 4 to 2 million. It was clear that the Nazis had captured millions of adherents from the other middle-class parties. It was also clear that henceforth it would be more difficult than ever for Brüning, or for anyone else, to command a stable majority in the Reichstag. Without such a majority, how could the Republic survive? This was a question on which the morrow of the 1930 elections became of increased interest to two pillars of a nation whose leaders had never really accepted the Republic, except as a passing misfortune in German history. The army and the world of the big industrialists and financiers. Flushed by his success at the polls, Hitler now turned his attention toward winning over these two particular groups. Long ago in Vienna, as we have seen, he had learned from the tactics of Mayor Karl Lueger the importance of bringing powerful existing institutions over to one side. What are you doing? I'm reading. The future does not lie with the parties of destruction, but rather the parties who carry themselves, the strength of the people, who are prepared and who wish to bind themselves to this army in order to aid the army someday in defending the interests of the people. In contrast, we still see the officers of our army belatedly tormenting themselves with the question as to how far can one go along with social democracy. But my dear sirs, where's the accent? The future... Damn, that's French. What the fuck? This was a most skillful bid for the support of the officers of the army, which, as most of them believed, as Hitler now repeated for the 100th time, had been stabbed in the back and betrayed by the very republic which they were now supporting, and which, moreover, had no love for the military caste and all it stood for. And then, in words which were prophetic of what he himself would one day do, he warned the officers of what would happen to them if the Marxists triumphed over the Nazis. Should that happen, he said, you may write over the German army. The end of the German army. From then, gentlemen, you must definitely become political. You may then become hangmen of the regime and political commissars. And if you do not behave, your wife and child will be put behind locked doors. And if you still do not behave, you will be thrown out and perhaps stood up against a wall. Relatively few persons heard the speech, but in order to propagate it in army circles, the Volksschreier Beobachter published it in verbatim, in a special army edition, and it was discussed at length in the columns of a Nazi monthly magazine, Deutscher Vergeist, a periodical devoted to military affairs, which had recently appeared. In 1927, the army had forbidden the recruitment of Nazis and the 100,000-man Reichswehr, and it even banned their employment as civilians in the arsenals and supply depots. By the end of 1929, it became obvious that Nazi propaganda was making headway in the army, especially among the younger officers, many of whom were not attracted only by Hitler's fanatical nationalism, but by the prospects he held out for an army restored to its old glory. And in size, there would be opportunities now denied them in such military force to advance to a higher rank. The Nazi infiltration into the armed services seemed serious enough to compel General Groener, now Minister of Defense, to issue an order of the day, January 22nd, 1930, which recalled a similar warning to the army by General von Seeckt on the eve of the Beer Hall Putsch 7 years before. The Nazis declared, were greedy for power. They, therefore, ruled the Wehrmacht in order to use it for the political aims of their party. They attempt to dazzle us with the National Socialists alone represent the truly national power. He requested the soldiers to refrain from politics and to serve the state, aloof from all party strife. That some of the young Reichswehr officers were not refraining from politics, or at least not Nazi politics, came to light shortly afterward and aroused the Fuhrer in Germany. Dissension in the highest echelons of the officer corps and delight in the Nazi camp. In spring 1930, 3 young lieutenants, Luden, Schrieger, and Wendt, of the garrison at Ulm were arrested for spreading Nazi doctrines in the army, for trying to induce their fellow officers to agree that in case of an armed Nazi revolt, they would not fire on the rebels. This last was high treason, but General Groener, not wishing to publicize the fact that treason existed in the army, attempted to hush up the affair by arranging for the accused to be tried before a court-martial for a simple breach of discipline. The defiance of Lieutenant Schrieger, who smuggled out of an inflammatory article of the Volksschreier Beobachten, made this possible. A week after the Nazi success in September elections of 1930, the 3 subalterns were rearranged before the Supreme Court at Leipzig on charges of high treason. Among the defenders were 2 rising Nazi lawyers, Hans Frank and Dr. Karl Sack. It was neither the lawyers nor the accused who occupied the limelight at the trial, but Adolf Hitler. He was called by Frank as a witness. His appearance represented a calculated risk. Okay, Hitler goes to court, and then afterwards he says, I can assure you that when the National Socialist movement is victorious in this struggle, there will be a National Socialist Court of Justice too. I've got to say it. I just got to say it. I'm angry. I'm just always angry. I don't even really know why I'm angry. And I think that's what draws me to it. There is a purity in my anger, which is wrath. And I can see how these parallels start lining up. And I do not want this to fuel my anger. I do not want this to enhance it. I want to understand it. It will always be a part of me. But I am glad all this turmoil is happening. Because my life would have been more difficult without it, without this chaos. If I had to truly exist in a world of order, it would be like living in chains for the rest of my life.
Paul, can I get some, oh, never mind.
The political ineptitude of the magnates of industry and finance was no less than that of the generals, and led to the mistaken belief that if they coughed up large enough sums for Hitler, he would be beholden to them, and if they ever came to power, do their bidding. That the Austrian upstart, as many of them had regarded him in the 1920s, might well take over control of Germany, began to dawn on the business leaders after the sensational Nazi gains in September elections of 1930. By 1931, Walter Funk testified at Nuremberg. My industrial friends and I were convinced that the Nazi Party would come to power in the not-too-distant future. In the summer of that year, Funk, a greasy, shifty-eyed, podgy little man, whose face always reminded this writer of a frog, gave up a lucrative job as an editor of a leading German financial newspaper, the Berliner, joined the Nazi Party, and became a contact man between the party and a number of important business leaders. He explained at Nuremberg that several of his industrialist friends, especially those prominent in the big Rhineland mining operations, had urged him to join the Nazi movement. in order to persuade the party to follow the course of private enterprise. Hitler then, as his future Reichsbank president and Minister of Economics says, was beginning to see the men in Germany who had the money, as he was telling them more or less what they wanted to hear. The party needed large sums of finance for their election campaigns and to pay the bill for its widespread and intensified propaganda campaigns, meaning the payroll of the SA and the SS, etc., etc. The businessmen and bankers were not the only financial resources. The party raised sizable sums from dues, assessments, collections, and the side of party newspapers, books, and periodicals. But they were not the largest. And the more money they gave the Nazis, the less they would have for the other conservative parties, which had been supporting them hitherto. Their identity was kept a secret from all but the inner circle around the leader. The party had to play both sides of the tracks, and it allowed Strasser, Goebbels, and the crank Fader to beguile the masses with the cry that the National Socialists were truly socialists, and against the money barons. On the other hand, money had to keep the party going, and to be wheeled out of those who had an ample supply of it. Throughout the latter half of 1931, says Diedrich, Hitler traversed Germany from one end to the other, holding private interviews with prominent business persons. Hitler had by now, by the start of 1931, gathered around him in the party a little band of fanatical, ruthless men who would help him in his final drive to power and who, with one exception, would be at his side to help him sustain that power during the years of the Third Reich. Through another of them, who was closest of all of them, and perhaps the ablest and most brutish of the lot, would not survive, even with his life, the second year of the Nazi government. There were 5 who stood above the other followers at this time. These were Gregor Strasser, Röhm, Göring, Goebbels, and Frick. Göring had returned to Germany at the end of 1927 following a political amnesty which the communists had helped the parties of the right put through the Reichstag. In Sweden, where he had spent most of his exile since 1923, he had been cured. Oh, so Göring was there at the putsch. I did not give you credit, Göring. Göring is definitely a character. He is easily as large. He, Mussolini, and Hitler are all in the same like cartoony kind of like realm. You're gonna once Göring gets in the picture, you're gonna see some silly shit. He walks around with a little fucking cane and he has a cape. But the problem with Göring is he crashed his fucking plane. And so he got on these painkillers and they just ruined his mind. He's a fucking drug addict. And he couldn't watch his weight. So when the Allies captured him, right? They were gonna fly him out of this fucking castle and the pilot's like, fuck, we can't take off. He's too big. I can't take off with this guy. So the leader of the Nazi Air Force was too big to fit in an American plane. That's Göring, right? If you would have had just a little less addiction or a little more like self-awareness or something, I don't know. But that's the thing though. They're all just hugely compromised in one way. They're very lopsided. They're very lopsided. They're not you don't see any Renaissance men among the fucking Nazis. They all do one thing. That's all they do is the one thing that they do because they can't do multiple things. They're not a full person. They end up becoming almost caricatures of themselves the longer they stay in because even though Göring is a larger-than-life character, and even though at the end he does betray Hitler, the last thing he ever does is betray Hitler. The last thing he does as a Nazi is betray Hitler. He never tells the Fuhrer no. He never tells the Fuhrer no, and the Fuhrer never tells him no. So they're just enabling each other forever. So that's Göring. But I'll tell you this, the thing about Göring is he is not boring. Not at all. These were the very connections which Hitler lacked but needed, and Goring soon became active in introducing the Nazi leader to his friends, and in counteracting in middle-class circles the bad odor which some of the brown-shirt ruffians exuded. In 1928, Hitler chose Goring as one of the 12 Nazi deputies to represent the party in the Reichstag, of which he became president when the Nazis became the first party in 1932, the largest party. It was in the official residence of the Reichstag president that many of the meetings were held and intrigues were hatched, which led to the party's ultimate triumph. And it was here, to jump ahead in time a little, that a plan was conceived that helped Hitler to stay in power after he became chancellor, to set the Reichstag on fire. Ernst Röhm had broken with Hitler in 1925, and not long afterward had gone off to join the Bolivian army as a lieutenant colonel. Toward the end of 1930, Hitler appealed to him to return. Man, that's mean. Well, Röhm left. And Hitler said, come back, it's okay now. But it wasn't okay. It wasn't okay. Hitler appealed to him to return and take over the leadership of the SA, which was getting out of hand. Its members, even its leaders, apparently believed in a coming Nazi revolution by violence. And with increasing frequency, they were taking to the streets to molest and murder with their political opponents. No election, national, provincial, or municipal, took place without savage battles in the gutters. Passing notice here must be taken of one of these encounters, for it provided National Socialism with its greatest martyr. One of the neighborhood leaders of the SA in Berlin was Horst Wessel, son of a Protestant chaplain who had forsaken his family and his studies to go live in a slum with a former prostitute and devote his life to fighting for Nazism. Many anti-Nazis always held that the youth earned his living as a pimp, though this charge may have been exaggerated. Certainly he consorted with pimps and prostitutes. He was murdered by some communists in February 1930 and would have passed into oblivion among with hundreds of other victims of both sides in the street wars, had it not been for the fact that he left behind a song whose words and tune he had composed. This was the Horst Wessel song, where it soon became the official song of the Nazi Party. And at the time, Röhm took over the SA. Gregor Strasser was undoubtedly the number 2 man of the Nazi Party. A forceful speaker and a brilliant organizer, he was the head of the party's most important office, the political organization, a post which gave him great influence among the provincial and local leaders whose labors were supervised. With his genial Bavarian nature, he was the most popular leader in the party next to Hitler, and unlike the Führer, he enjoyed personal trust, and even liking most of his political opponents. There were a good many at that time, within and without the party, who believed that Strasser might well supplant the moody, incalculable Austrian leader. This view was especially strong in the Reichswehr and in the President's Palace. Otto, Gregor Strasser's brother, had fallen by the wayside. Unfortunately for him, he had taken seriously not only the word socialist, but the word workers, and the party's official name of National Socialist German Workers' Party. He had supported certain strikes of the socialist trade unions and demanded that the party come out for the nationalization of industry. This, of course, was heresy to Hitler, who accused Otto Strasser of professing the cardinal sin of democracy and liberalism. Goebbels, the 4th member of the Big Five around Hitler, had remained an enemy and rival of Gregor Strasser ever since their break in 1926. 2 years after that, he had succeeded Strasser as propaganda chief of the party. when the latter was moved to the head political organization. He had remained as Gutler of Berlin, and his achievements in reorganizing the party there, as well as his talents for propaganda, had favorably impressed the Fuhrer. His glib but biting tongue and his nimble mind had not endeared him to Hitler's other chief lieutenants, who distrusted him. But the Nazi leader was quite content to see strife among his principal subordinates, if only because it was a safeguard against their conspiring together against his leadership. He never fully trusted Strasser, but in the loyalty of Goebbels he had complete confidence. Moreover, the lame little fanatic was bubbling with ideas which were useful to him. Finally, Goebbels' talents as a rowdy journalist and as a rabble-rousing orator were invaluable to the party. Wilhelm Frick, the fifth and last member of the group, was the only colorless personality in it. He was a typical German civil servant. As a young police officer in Munich, before 1923, he had served as one of Hitler's spies at police headquarters, and the Führer always felt grateful to him. Often he had taken on the thankless tasks. On Hitler's instigation, he had become the first Nazi to hold political office. Some of the lesser men in the party in the early 30s would subsequently gain notoriety and frightening political power in the Third Reich. Heinrich Himmler, the poultry farmer, who, with his peace knees, might be mistaken for a mild, mediocre schoolmaster. He had a degree in agronomy from the Munich Hochschule. Okay, great. There was Dr. Robert Ley, a chemist by profession, a habitual drunkard, who was the Gottlieb of Cologne, and Hans Frank, the bright young lawyer and leader of the party's legal division. There was Walter Dare, born in 1895 in the Argentine, an able agronomist, who was won over by National Socialism by Hess and the book The Peasantry as a life source of the Nordic race, brought him to Hitler's attention, and to a job as head of the agriculture department of the party. Rudolf Hess himself, personally unambitious and doggedly loyal to the leader, held only the title of private secretary to the Führer. The second private secretary was one Martin Bormann, a mole-like man who preferred to burrow in the dark recesses of party life. To further his intrigues, he had once served a year in prison for complicity in a political murder. The Reich youth leader was Baldur von Schirach, a romantically minded young man, an energetic organizer, whose mother was an American, and whose great-grandfather, a Union officer, had lost a leg at Bull Run. He told his American jailers at Nuremberg that he'd become an anti-Semite at the age of 17 after reading the book The Eternal Jew by Henry Ford. There was also Alfred Rosenberg, the ponderous, dim-witted Baltic pseudo-philosopher, who was, as we have seen, was one of Hitler's mentors, and who since the Putsch of 1923 had poured out a stream of books and pamphlets of the most muddled content and style, culminating in a 700-page book entitled The Myth of the 20th Century. This was a ludicrous concoction of his half-baked ideas on Nordic supremacy, palmed off as the fruit of which passed for erudition in Nazi circles, a book which Hitler often said jokingly he had tried unsuccessfully to read, and which prompted Schirach, who fancied himself as a writer, to remark once that Rosenberg was a man who sold more copies of a book no one ever read than of any other author. For the first time in 10 years, after its publication in 1930, it sold more than 500,000 copies. From the beginning to the end, Hitler always had a warm spot in his heart for this dull, stupid, fumbling man, rewarding him with various party jobs as an editor of the Volksreihe Beobachten and other Nazi publications, and naming him as one of the party's deputies in the Reichstag in 1930. Such was the conglomeration of men around the leader of National Socialists. In a normal society, they assuredly would have stood out as a grotesque assortment of misfits. But in the last chaotic days of the Republic, they began to appear to millions of befuddled Germans as saviors. And they had two advantages over their opponents. They were led by a man who knew exactly what they wanted, and they were ruthless enough and opportunist enough to go to any lengths to help him get it. As the year of 1931 ran its uneasy course, with 5 million wage earners out of work, the middle class facing ruin, the farmers unable to meet their mortgage payments, the parliament paralyzed, the government floundering, the 84-year-old president fast sinking into the befuddlement of senility, a confidence mounted in the breasts of the Nazi chieftains that they would not have to wait. Let's hear that. Let's make comparisons to now. The middle class faces ruin, the farmers unable to meet their mortgage payments, the parliament paralyzed, the government floundering, the 84-year-old president fast sinking into the befuddlement of senility. He goes on, but that's the end of the chapter. I like this writer because he's a good one. I like good writers. I don't like bad writers. Red Victory, or August 1918. Okay, it goes to August 1918, then Red Victory. I tried reading those to understand the Russian perspective, and it's daunting. I asked this English teacher twice the same question. I said, how can I understand this shit? There's so many characters. And he said, you have to make a list. You have to make notes while you, that just don't. I think a good writer does that for me, or maybe that's just how Russian literature is. I couldn't keep up with it. 1918 is like a bunch of fictional stories that happen. August 19th. That's great. Red Victory, interesting in the beginning, not interesting all the way through. But this guy, I like him. The way he writes, I like him. Oh. But the reason, yeah, I almost forgot. The reason, though, is this is the first time he's written the word society. Okay, we're at page 149. He hasn't said the word society once. Look, society is a word for pseudo-intellectuals that sound really intelligent to people that have no idea what's going on. If you ever hear somebody say society, they're trying to make a point. Just like I am right now. If you ever hear someone say society, just even shut me up. It means nothing. Okay, what it is at best, it's a series of expectations. It's expectations about expectations. Okay, and there's always a connotation as to whether or not it's the good one or the bad one, or for example, right? There's this phrase that gets passed around all the time. This is overrated. That's overrated. What does that mean? What does being overrated even mean? It's better than what people say. It's just your opinion, man. Just have a fucking opinion. And that's all society is. It's just your opinion. It doesn't matter if you have a fucking degree or if you fucking went to a seminar. If you live in a society, you are an expert of it. So it doesn't mean anything. It's like me saying I'm a food expert because I can eat. Or no. Let me say that. No. Okay, there are food experts and there are dietitians. No, never mind. My analogy doesn't work. That's okay. I'm not as smart as I think I am. Out of the turmoil and chaos of German life, there now emerged a curious and devious figure, more than any other single individual, was destined to dig the grave of the Republic. One who would serve briefly as its last chancellor and, ironically, one of the final twists of his astonishing career, desperately try to save it when it was too late. This was Kurt von Schleicher, whose name in German means intriguer or sneak. In 1931, he was a lieutenant general in the army. Born in 1882, he had entered military service at 18 as a subaltern in Hindenburg's old regiment, the 3rd Foot Guards, where they became a close friend of Oskar von Hindenburg, the son of Field Marshal and then President. His second friendship proved almost as valuable. This was with General Groener, who was impressed by his brilliance as a student at the War Academy, and who, when he had replaced Ludendorff at Supreme Headquarters in 1918, brought along the young officer as his adjutant. Primarily a desk officer, he had seen but a short period of service in the Russian front. Schleicher remained thereafter close to the sources of power in the military and in the Weimar Republic, where his nimble mind, affable manners, and flair for politics impressed both the generals and the politicians. Under General von Seeckt, he played an increasingly important role in helping to organize the illegal Free Corps and the equally illegally and highly secret Black Reichswehr. And he was a key figure in the confidential negotiations with Moscow, which led to the camouflage training of German tank and air officers in Soviet Russia and the establishment of German-run arms factories there. A gifted manipulator with a passion for intrigue, Schleicher worked best under cover in the dark. Until the beginning of the 30s, his name was unknown to the general public, and for some time previously, it had been attracting increasing notice in the Blenderstrasse, where the War Ministry was, and the Wilhelmstrasse, where the government ministries were situated. In January 1928, he used his growing influence with President Hindenburg, whom he had become close enough to his friendship with Oscar, to have his old chief, General Groener, appointed as Minister of Defense, the first military man to hold that post during the Republic. Groener made Schleicher his right-hand man in the ministry, putting him in charge of a new office, the Ministry Bureau, Ministramt, where he handled the political and press affairs of the Army and Navy. Okay, Schleicher. Oh, so this is the end of Schleicher. On October 10th, 1931, 3 weeks after the suicide of his niece and sweetheart, yes, Geli Rubo, Hitler was received by President Hindenburg for the first time. Schleicher, busy weaving a new web of intrigue, had made the appointment. Earlier that autumn, he had conferred with Hitler and arranged for him to see both the Chancellor and the President. In the back of his mind, as well as that of Brüning, was the question of what to do when Hindenburg's 7-year term of office came to an end in the spring of 1932. The Field Marshal would be 85 then, and the periods when his mind were lucid were diminishing. Still, as everyone relished, if he were not a candidate to succeed himself, Hitler, though he was not legally a German citizen, might contrive to become one for the first office, to win the election, and become president. During the summer, the scholarly Chancellor had pondered long hours over the desperate plight of Germany. He quite realized that his government had become the most popular one of the Republic had ever built. To cope with a depression that had decreed lower wages and salaries, as well as lower prices and clamped down severe restrictions on businesses, finance, and social services, the Hunger Chancellor had been called by both the Nazis and the Communists. Yet, he thought he saw a way out. In the end, he would reestablish a stable, free, prosperous Germany. He would try to negotiate with the Allies a cancellation of reparation, whose payments had been temporarily stopped by the Hoover moratorium. In the disarmament conference, scheduled to begin the following year, he would try either to get the Allies to honor their pledge in the Versailles Treaty, disarm to the level of Germany, or allow Germany to embark openly on a modest program of rearmament, which in fact, with his conveyance in secret, it had already started to do so. Thus, the last shackle of peace would be thrown off, and Germany would emerge as an equal among the big powers. This would not only be a boon to the Republic, but might launch, Brüning thought, a new era of confidence in the Western world that would put an end to the economic depression which had brought the German people such misery, and it would take the wind out of Nazi sails. Brüning planned to move boldly on the home front too, and to bring about, by agreement of all major parties, save the communists, a fundamental change in the German constitution. He meant to restore the Hohenzollern monarchy. Even if Hindenburg could be persuaded to run again, he could not be expected at his age to live out another full term of 7 years. Should he die in another year or two, the way would still be open for Hitler to be elected president. To forestall that, to assure permanency and establish in the office the head of state, Browning broached the following plan. In 1932, presidential elections will be called off, and Hindenburg's term of office simply extended, as it could be, by a two-thirds vote on the two houses of parliament, the Reichstag and the Reichsrat. As soon as that was achieved, he would propose that the parliament proclaim a monarchy, with the president as regent. On his death, one of the sons of the crown prince would be put on the Hohenzollern throne. This act would take the wind out of the Nazis. In fact, Brüning was confident that it would mean their end as a political force. But the aged president was not interested. He whose duty it had been as commander of the Imperial Army to tell Kaiser on the dark day of November in 1918 at Spa that he must go, that the monarchy was at an end, would not consider any of Hohenzollerns resuming on the throne, except the emperor himself, who still lived in exile at Doorn in Holland. When Brüning explained to him that the Social Democrats and their trade unions, which with the greatest reluctance had given some encouragement to his plan, only because it might afford the last desperate chance of stopping Hitler, would not stand for the return of either Wilhelm II or his eldest son, and moreover, if the monarchy were restored, it would be constitutional and democratic, one on the lines of the British model. The grisly old field marshal was so outraged, he summarily dismissed the chancellor from his presence. A week later, he recalled him to inform him that he would not stand for re-election. In the meantime, first Brüning and then Hindenburg had their first meeting with Adolf Hitler. Both talks went badly for the Nazi leader. He had not yet recovered from the blow of Gally Rubel's suicide. His mind wandered, and he was unsure of himself. To Brüning's request for Nazi support for the continuance in office of Hindenburg, Hitler answered with a long tirade against the Republic, which left little doubt that he would not go along with the Chancellor's plans. With Hindenburg, Hitler was at ill ease. He tried to impress the old gentleman with a long harangue, but it fell flat. The president, at his first meeting, was not impressed by the Bohemian corporal, as he called him, and told Schleicher that such a man might become minister of posts, but never chancellor, words which the field marshal would later have to eat. Hitler, in a huff, hastened to Bad Harzburg, where on the next day, October 11th, he joined a massive demonstration of the national opposition against the governments of Germany and Prussia. This was an assembly, not so much of the radical right, represented by the National Socialists, as of the older, conservative forces of reaction. Hindenburg's National Party, the right-wing veterans' private army, the Stahlhelm, the so-called Bismarck Youth, the Junkers Agrarian League, and an odd assortment of old generals. But the Nazi leader did not have his heart in the meeting. He despised the frock-coated, top-hatted, bemedaled relics of the old regime, with whom he saw it might be dangerous to associate a revolutionary movement like his too closely. He erased through his speech in a perfunctory manner, and left the field up before the parade of the Stahlhelm, which was, to his annoyance, had shown up in larger numbers than the SA. The Harzburg Front, which was formed that day, and which represented the effort of the old-line conservatives to bring Nazis into a unified front to begin a final assault on the Republic. Hitler had no intention of playing second fiddle to these gentlemen, whose minds, he thought, were buried in the past, which he knew there was no return. He might use them for the moment, if they had helped to undermine the Weimar regime, and made available to him as they did new financial resources. But he would not, in turn, be used by them. Within a few days the Harzburg Front was going to collapse. The various elements of it were at once more at each other's throats, except on one issue. Both Hugenberg and Hitler refused to agree to Brüning's proposal that Hindenburg's terms of office be prolonged. At the end of 1932, the Chancellor renewed... Okay, there's a great deal of posturing. There's a great deal of posturing. For more than a year, the Reich government and various state governments had been coming into possession of documents which showed that a number of high Nazi leaders, especially the SA, were preparing to take over Germany by force and institute a reign of terror. On the eve of the first presidential elections for the SA, now 400,000 strong, had been fully mobilized and thrown into a cordon around Berlin. Though Captain Röhm, the SA chief, assured General von Schleicher that the measure was merely precautionary, the Prussian police had seized documents at Nazi headquarters in Berlin, which made it pretty clear the SA meant to carry out a coup d'etat on the following evening, should Hitler be elected president. Such was Röhm's hurry. Goebbels, in a diary notation, on the night of March 11th, had confirmed that something was afoot. Talked over instructions with the SA and SS commanders. Deep uneasiness is rife everywhere. The word putsch haunts the air. Both the national and state governments were alarmed. On April 5th, representatives of several states, led by Prussia and Bavaria, the two largest, had demanded that the general government suppress the SA, or else they would do it themselves in their respective territories. Chancellor Brüning was away from Berlin electioneering, but Groener, who received the delegates in his capacity of Minister of the Interior and of Defense, promised action as soon as Brüning returned, which was on April 10th, the day of the second election. Brüning and Göring thought that they had good reasons for stamping out the SA. It would end the threat of civil war and might be a prelude to the end of Hitler as a major factor in German politics. Certain of Hindenburg's re-election by an absolute majority, they felt that the voters were giving them a mandate to protect the Republic against the threats of Nazis, to forcibly overthrow it. The time had come to use force against force. Also, they acted vigorously. The government would lose support of the National Democrats, the trade unions, which were providing most of the votes for Hindenburg, and the chief banking for the continuance of Brüning's government. The cabinet met on April 10th, in the midst of the polling, and decided to immediately suppress Hitler's private armies. There was some difficulty in getting Hindenburg to sign the decree. Schleicher, who had some difficulty in getting Hindenburg to sign the decree, began to whisper objections in the president's ear. But he finally did so on April 13th, and was promulgated on April 14th. This was a stunning blow to the Nazis. Röhm and some of the hotheads in the party urged resistance to the order, but Hitler, shrewder than his lieutenants, ruled that it must be obeyed. This was no moment for armed rebellion. Besides, there was interesting news about Schleicher. Goebbels noted in his diary on the very day, "We are informed that Schleicher does not approve Groener's action." And later that day, a telephone call from a well-known lady who was a close friend of General Schleicher. She says the general wants to resign. Goebbels was interested, but not skeptical. "Perhaps," he added, "it is only a maneuver. Neither he nor Hitler nor anyone else, certainly nor Brüning, and most certainly not Groener, to whom Schleicher owed his rapid rise in the army and the councils of government, had as yet surmised the infinite capacity for treachery of the scheming political general. But they were soon to learn. Even before the ban on the SA was promulgated, Schleicher, who had won over the weak-minded commander of the Reichswehr, General von Hammerstein, confidently informed the commanders of the 7 military districts that the army opposed the move. Next, he persuaded Hindenburg to write a cantankerous letter to Groener, asking why the Reichsbanner, the parliamentary organization of the Social Democrats, had not been suppressed along with the SA. Schleicher took out a further step to undermine his chief's position. He inspired a malicious smear campaign against General Groener, spreading tales that he was too ill to remain in office, that he had become a convert to Marxism and even to pacifism, and proclaiming that the defense minister had disgraced the army by having a child born 5 months after his recent marriage. The baby, he told Hindenburg, had only been nicknamed Nurmi in army circles, and after the first fleet finished runner of the Olympic... By the end of the first week of May 1932, Schleicher's intrigues reached one of their climaxes. Goebbels notes on May 4th that Hitler's mines are beginning to go off. First Groener, and then Brüning must go. On May 8th, Goebbels reported in his diary, Hitler had a decisive conference with General Schleicher and with some gentlemen close to the president. Everything goes well. Brüning will fall in a few days. The president withdraws his confidence in him. He then outlines his plan that Schleicher and the president's Camarilla had hatched with Hitler. The Reichstag will be dissolved. A presidential cabinet will be installed, and all prohibitions against the SA and the Nazi Party lifted. To avoid arousing Brüning's suspicion of what is up, Goebbels adds, Hitler will keep away from Berlin. Late that evening, he spirits his chief away to Mecklenburg, and then into virtual hiding. For the Nazis, the presidential cabinet is regarded, Goebbels notes the next day, as merely an interim affair. Such a colorless transitional government, he says, will clear the way for us. The weaker it is, the easier we can do away with it. This, of course, was not the view of Schleicher, who already is dreaming of a new government which will dominate. Already, it is clear, he and Hitler believe they can get the best of each other. But for the moment, he has an ace to play. He can assure the tired old president they can offer what Brüning cannot. A government supported by Hitler, yet without the inconvenience of having all the fanatical demagogue in it. So, all was ready. On May 10th, 2 days after striking his deal with Hitler and the men around Hindenburg, Schleicher struck. The blow was delivered at the Reichstag. General Groener rose to defend the Banting of the SA and was violently attacked by Brüning. Ill with diabetes and sick at the heart of the treachery already wrought by Schleicher, the defense minister tried to defend himself as best as he could, but was overwhelmed by a torrent of abuse, the Nazi benches. Exhausted and humiliated, he tried to leave the chamber, only to run into General von Schleicher, who had informed him coldly that he no longer enjoyed the confidence of the army and must resign. Groener appealed to Hindenburg, for whom he had loyally fronted, and taken the blame when the crucial moment had come. First in 1918, to tell the Kaiser to go, and then in 1919, to advise the Republican government to sign the Versailles Treaty. But the old field marshal, who had never ceased resenting his obligation to the younger officer, replied that he regretted he could do nothing in the matter. The plan called for Brüning's head next, and that was not long before the conniving general was able to slip it on the block. Brüning's fall had been a grave setback for the tottering republic. Almost none among the military men had served it ably and devoted, and there was none else in the army of his stature and loyalty to replace him. But the stubborn, hard-working Brüning was still a power, and he had secured the backing of the majority of Germans for Hindenburg's re-election, as he believed, for the continuance of the Republic. He seemed to be on the eve of sensational successes in foreign policy, with regard to the cancellation of reparations and quality of armament for the Reich. But the aging president, as we have seen, had rewarded with a remarkable coolness the Chancellor's superhuman efforts in winning him a further term of office. His service became more frigid when Brüning proposed that the state had taken over a number of bankrupt Junker estates in East Prussia, after generous compensation, and gave them to landless peasants. When Hindenburg went off for the Easter holidays at the middle of May to Neudeck, the Eastern Prussian estate, which the Junkers, with the financial help of the industrialists, had given him as a prospect on his 18th birthday, had got an earful from his aristocratic neighbors, who clamored for the dismissal of a chancellor, who they now called an agrarian Bolshevist.